You're listening to Life Repurposed with Michelle Rayburn, where you'll find uplifting and practical advice for everyday living, creative inspiration for do-it-yourself projects, and recommendations for books and resources that will encourage you to embrace your life repurposed. I'm your host, Michelle Rayburn. This is episode number 64 of Life Repurposed. This week is going to be a little bit different, a little shorter, I think, although sometimes I go a little bit longer than I plan on going. But I'm going to share an opportunity for you to give your story. And so I want you to hear this. I thought about sending it out as an email. I think it's really important to share this with my podcast audience because it really ties in with the history of this podcast. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that history. And I also want to tell you right off the top that I'm part of the Christian Podcasters Association. And very soon, my story of how this podcast got started is going to be shared on there. So watch for that link to come. But in the meantime, in the show notes, I'll give you a link to the Christian Podcasters Association, just so you can check out that website and that Facebook group if you're interested in that. But when I started this podcast 2 years ago, it was because I wanted to extend the message from my book, which is called The Repurposed and Upcycled Life. I wanted to take that to a forum where I could inspire listeners, but also to feature other people's stories and resources. So when I wrote that book, it's a humorous Christian living book with some application questions and projects and stuff you can do. I did that because I told my story almost like a memoir in that book. But when I brought it to the podcast, I wanted it to be about also sharing other people's stories and providing some additional resources. I love how that continues to develop as more guests will be coming in the next few months and episodes will continue to offer practical advice for everyday living. I'm looking forward to continuing that, but I also have something new to tell you about today that will expand the reach of Life Repurposed. I thought it was really important to tell you on the podcast about what's coming for the podcast. I'm working on a book project, and this is a thread that ties everything together in much of my writing work, and it has to do with how God turns trash to treasure. It's how He repurposes our junk for His glory. And borrowing from popular trends of decorating with vintage junk, our stories show that flawed people can be used by God and that His power is made perfect in weakness. Now, I started out as a decorating blogger quite a few years ago, and I ended up turning that into a much more meaningful message. Not that there isn't a lot of fun and connection that can be had with decorating, but I used to share examples of things that I transformed that I found at yard sales, and I would give the before and the after picture. I would also repurpose things into something unusual. For example, one of my favorites that I share sometimes when I'm speaking is an old rusty cheese grater that I turned into a luminary for a candle. Like really, literally turned it into it by just setting it over a candle. It's that simple. But some of those simple projects are really fun. So anyway, that was how I got started. And then that eventually became the book that I mentioned, The Repurposed and Upcycled Life, When God Turns Trash to Treasure. And that became part of a Bible study. It's a theme that carries into other books I've written as well. So that was how I got started out as a decorating blogger. But here's the exciting news. In 2021, I'm going to release a book that features the stories of other people who have experienced God's repurposing. So up until now, I've been writing about my own story and then sharing some stories here on the podcast. But now I'm extending an invitation to submit stories for consideration to my writer friends and also my readers and my listeners here on the podcast, because I know some of you out there have stories to share. Some of you are excellent writers, but haven't yet published anything. You've been kind of hiding your skills in the closet. I've just posted a call for submissions for a book called Life Repurposed, Stories of Grace, Hope, and Restored Faith. Now, the premise of this book is going to focus on stories of everyday people where God's renovation is demonstrated in their before and after stories. These aren't necessarily dramatic, but they could be. Sometimes God changes an attitude or a circumstance in a way that helps us to mature spiritually, or we develop deeper faith, or we discover new purpose. And sometimes the transformation is tremendous, but not dramatic, if that makes sense. You know, it's not like we have necessarily a tragic story, although some people do. It's more that there's this transformation that's amazing because we're almost like a new person, and it's all because of something God has done in us. So this is going to feature that. Your journey can inspire others. Stories in this book will feature how our imperfections and struggles are part of the way we learn and grow, and the change in us points other people toward God and encourages hope. That's what's happening in the book. Now, this is not a devotional, but it's a Christian living book. There is a difference there. Devotionals are much shorter chapters. This isn't a Bible study either. I've written those, but that isn't what this is. The chapters are a little longer than devotionals and more story-based, and they will help us to explore faith from a place where people who haven't really grown up in the church will still feel comfortable connecting with the writers and applying the takeaways to life. So that's really important to remember, that one of my purposes in life is to connect with people who feel disconnected from church. A lot of writing is done just for Christian people, and I think there's a place for that, of course. That's why I write Bible studies. It's usually people who are Christians who want to go deeper in their faith. But I also like to reach out to people who are questioning, doubting, wavering, who have some kind of a background in Christian faith, but they aren't sure where they've landed right now. There's something going on in life that has really shaken them, and they're just not sure. I want people who fit into that category to also feel comfortable with the things that I write, because I want to invite them to reopen a door they might have closed. So why is this the focus of this episode? Okay. Rather than featuring people who have it all together, it's really about how God shows up in the mess and makes us into people who look more like Jesus. And I want to invite others to be part of that. I wanted you to hear my heart on this project. I wanted you to hear my voice as I talk about it, and not just read it on a blog post or read it on a social media post. I want to invite you to be part of this project. This is called Life Repurposed, just like the name of this podcast, for a reason. It directly connects to this show. That brings me to the second exciting announcement. I've started a public group on Facebook called Life Repurposed. Now, I really wrestled with this. I'm like, do I want a Facebook group? Do I want a page for this podcast? And I always said no. I always said I could direct people to my author page because that's where I want to interact with people. But I've been thinking about it a lot, and I talked with my writing coach and came up with the landing place that I really do need to have a Facebook group. This group is for you, my listeners, and for the future readers of the book that I just told you about. It's where I'll share some announcements about the book, and I'll give sneak peeks into some of the stories, and I'll be posting discussion questions and things like that related to topics in the book, but also related to topics on our podcast episodes. It might be as simple as one post a week where I just ask a question. But coming up, there will be some more things happening there that are related to Life Repurposed. So ultimately, it's an extension of what I do that will help me communicate more personally with you, because I really do want to know you. And interacting just on my author page, there's so much other stuff that happens there. And I write other books, like I have a marriage book, and that really, it sort of ties in, but it's not the same. So I think this is a really good opportunity for me to really focus in on the audience for Life Repurposed. So what should you do next? Well, you're going to want to head to the show notes to grab a couple of links that I'm going to share in the resources right now. Let's talk about the writing opportunity first. If you'd like to know more about the book project for Life Repurposed, the link is on my website in the show notes at michellerayburn.com/64. That's just for this episode number 64. So michellerayburn.com/64. There are specific guidelines to follow, similar to all professional publishers. Be sure to follow those, since that will give you a much higher chance of getting your story included. I'm limiting this to the top 30 stories, and I'll be choosing some before the submission deadline. So earlier is better. First week of January is when I'm hoping to have all of the stories in so that I can select the final ones, but get yours in early if you're thinking about contributing. The link you'll find in the show notes also answers a lot of questions about the audience, the purpose of the project, and also the charity to which I'm donating a portion of the book royalties. So you do want to go to michellerayburn.com/64 and find out more about that, because there's a whole document there to download that gives you all the stuff you need to know on how to write. If you are a first-time writer and this is the first time you're doing something like that, just be aware that whenever you write for publication, there are guidelines to follow, and the editors are expecting you to follow that. So it's important to read all of that. And if you have questions, to reach out to other writers or people who are experienced with publishing so that you can find out, like, what does this mean? I'm hoping you'll use me as a last resource so that I can spend my time editing versus answering questions that you can find in other places. So the other thing I want to tell you about in the resources here is that in those show notes, I will also give a link to the new Life Repurposed Facebook group. It's brand spanking new, so I'll be adding content as we go, but you can sign up right away so you don't miss anything. That link is there at michellerayburn.com/64 in the show notes for this episode. The Facebook group is a public group, so we won't be discussing private details, but it's really a place to celebrate what a repurposed life is all about, God's greatness. So I thank you for letting me share this exciting news with you today. I'll be back next week with our regularly scheduled program, but in the meantime, make sure you check out the brand new Facebook group and you check out the Writer's Guidelines for Life Repurposed at michellerayburn.com/64. You can also share the Writer's Guidelines with your friends, and you can invite your friends to be part of the Facebook group too. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. I am so happy that you tuned in today to Life Repurposed, and I'll see you next week. You've been listening to Life Repurposed with Michelle Rayburn. Check out tips, resources, and inspiration at michellerayburn.com. I'd love it if you would subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or Spotify. I'd also love it if you would like, review, and share the information about this podcast with your friends. Thank you so much for listening.